All right. Tonight we're going to cover Esther Chapter 7, which is only 10 verses. So you'd think it should be fairly short. Joke's on you. No, I've got about the same material as always. All right. So have you ever been in a situation in life where you thought you had everything planned out perfectly and there was no way anything could go wrong? Yeah, right? We've all been there. We all think that. I remember one year, most of you have heard this story, I'm sure, but one year I planned a trip to go visit a friend of mine in Florida over Thanksgiving weekend. And, I had found a hotel room locally and talked to the guy that ran the hotel, and he assured me the room was plenty big to handle the 5 of us, and everything was going to be great. And we got over there. No, it was horrible. So we got over there, and the room was teeny tiny, and it had a little day bed and a queen size bed, and that was it. And this guy told me the room would sleep 5, and one little bitty bathroom. And then my buddy, I hadn't communicated with him effectively. He had plans the day we got there, and so we met for dinner that night, and then he had plans part of the day the next day. And what was it? We went to Burger King or something. It was Taco Bell. They all remember. So we went to Taco Bell, got a bunch of tacos and burritos for lunch, and then met up, and the women got in the vehicle with his wife, and they went to the craft store or something, and the men got in our vehicle, and we went to do important stuff. We went to the music store and the comic book store, right? And so the leftover tacos are sitting in the back of the van, and I've got teenage boys, and we get in the van at one point after switching stores, and they said, "Hey, can we eat these leftover tacos?" I was like, "Have at it." Bad mistake. So leaving dinner that night, I think it started with him. I mean, we didn't get out the parking lot of the restaurant leaving dinner, and he started getting terribly nauseated. Got back to the hotel room, and by the time we got to the hotel room, both of the boys were fully inundated with the food poisoning. And it was horrific. It was horrible. There was a quinceañera going on downstairs, so they had music blasting, and right, and then a thunderstorm rolled through and blew the window in. The whole window came out of its frame and blew in on top of Charlotte while she was laying in that little day bed. And fortunately, I was able to wedge it back up in there. And we got through the night. The high point of the weekend was supposed to be Sunday morning when I was going to my preacher buddy's church to give a gospel presentation to the children. And we did not make it to church that Sunday morning. I texted him. I told him, "Dude, my kids have been sick all night. Nobody slept. We're going home." So it was terrible. So we raced home to try and get my family back comfortable. And then thinking about it, it occurred to me, I never once prayed about it. Never even crossed my mind. I did what I thought was right. I'd made a good plan. It was foolproof. And all my plans went wrong. So between last week and tonight, we've been studying a similar scenario, right? We had a guy who thought he had a foolproof plan. The key difference between my situation and Haman's is that my goal was to have fun with my family, and his goal was to seek revenge for his own exaltation. So last week we kind of ended on a cliffhanger. Haman, this very bad guy, had a very bad day, but it's not over yet. We ended in the middle of the day, if you remember. We ended with Haman being dragged off to the feast that he originally intended to go to with a merry heart to go drink with the king and the queen, and instead he got drug off by the eunuchs because nothing was going his way and he was unhappy. So let's read our scriptures for tonight, and then we'll kind of walk through them and talk about them. So Esther chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. Then the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day, also as they drank their wine at the feast, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be given you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I found favor in your eyes, O king, if it seems good to the king, let my life be given to me as my petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be caused to perish. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the adversity would not be worth the annoyance to the king. Then King Xerxes said to Esther the queen, "Who is this one and where is this one who fills his heart to do thus?" So Esther said, "An adversary and an enemy is this evil Haman." Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. And the king arose in his wrath from drinking wine and went into the garden of his palace. But Haman stayed to seek for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that calamity had been determined against him by the king. Now the king returned from the garden of his palace into the place where they were drinking wine, and Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. So the king said, "Will he even assault the queen with me in the house?" As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbonah, one of the eunuchs who were before the king, said, "Behold, indeed, the gallows, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king, are standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's wrath subsided. All right. So in verses 1 and 2, right, we are at the second feast that Esther had requested. If you remember, she approached the king, and he told her to make her request, and he'd give it to her. And she just asked, "Come attend this special feast that I'm throwing, just you and Haman." And at the first feast, he asked her, "Hey, what do you actually want?" And she said, "No, I just want you to come to another feast tomorrow night, and then I'll make my request known." Right? That should all be fairly familiar. That's recent. So now we're at the second feast. I do want to take a minute here and engage in some speculation. I know that speculation is often a bad thing, right? Because you tend to read things into the text that aren't necessarily there. But I also think it can offer us some value and help the history come alive to us, right? So if you're willing to humor me for a minute, let's speculate about the emotional state of each of our people in this story. So Xerxes is probably feeling just fine. He had a sleepless night last night, right? But I would expect that he thinks the reason of his sleeplessness has been resolved. He recognized Mordecai properly during the day. We probably all would agree that the reason Xerxes had his sleepless night is because God intended to magnify Mordecai and humble Haman using Xerxes. And it's my opinion that Xerxes sees this as just kind of another day. He's definitely curious about what's bothering Esther, because he's very persistent in asking her, "What do you want? What do you want? What do you want?" But overall, I think Xerxes is just fine, minus all the pressure of ruling the largest empire in the world and living in utter luxury. I'm sure that's difficult for him. All right, so Esther. At this point, my best guess is that Esther is calm but a little bit nervous. Right? No doubt she's heard what had happened earlier in the day with Mordecai being paraded around town and exalted in front of the whole city. And certainly that would give her some comfort, but she still knows what has to be done. She knows that she has to expose Haman for what he is and ask the king to reverse his own law, which is illegal for the king to do. So, although she's likely nervous, she's probably still pretty composed. Right? She's gotten past the most dangerous part of this, which is entering into the king's court without being called. The fact that he hasn't killed her has to be somewhat comforting. And to this point, Xerxes has been very kind and accommodating to her. So that'd help ease the nerves a little bit. She probably still has butterflies in her stomach. But you figure in the 6 months that she was trained in the harem before she was presented to the king and selected as his queen, and in the years that have passed since then, she was trained in how to put on the proper face, how to interact with royalty, and she had a fair amount of practice with it. She's been the queen for 5 years, right? So overall, Esther's probably a little bit nervous but calm. And I think we can all identify with that, right? There are times in our lives that although we're at peace with an issue, we still are nervous about it or maybe a little anxious. Kind of like pulling off a Band-Aid. You know what's coming. So do you just peel it off slowly or do you yank it? Depends on the person. Everyone's different, right? All right, so Haman Haman is probably in the worst shape of the three. Right? He's had an absolutely miserable day by his assessment. First, his scheme to have that cursed Mordecai killed was foiled. And then he was forced to personally exalt Mordecai in front of the whole city of Susa. And then when he got home, his friends and wife assured him that Mordecai would be his downfall. Then he's literally dragged off to this feast. And I imagine at this point, Haman just wants to go home and go to bed. I just want this day to end. He's probably worried sick about what the outcome of all this is going to be, realistically. He can't figure out what this whole, I'm sure, it'd be racing through my mind. What is this whole business with Mordecai about? What did my wise men mean when they said that? Right? It would be driving me nuts if I were him. But Haman is also accustomed to being around in royal functions, right? And being around the king. And so although he probably had a firm and calm exterior, I bet he was a mess inside. I mean, I bet he was a swirling, nervous wreck. All right, that's my speculation, because it doesn't tell us what their emotions were. All right, in verse 1, the feast begins. Haman and Xerxes gathered with Esther. They start to drink wine and have their feast. Then in verse 2, Xerxes asks Esther again, "Make your request known. I will give it to you up to half the kingdom." So in verses 3 and 4, Esther finally speaks and actually makes her request known. And I want you to pay attention to how she framed it, right? Sometimes the most crucial part of a conversation is how you frame it and how you communicate it. She starts with her normal royal pleasantries, right? If I found favor in the king's eyes. And then she says, "Let my life be given to me as my petition, and my people as my request." So far, so good. She says the request she has come to make is literally for her own life and for the lives of all the Jews. And she continues on to say that they've been sold to be killed. Right? And she said, if we had only been sold as slaves, I wouldn't bother with it. I wouldn't bother you with it. At least they'd still be alive, right? So notice Esther's humility. Right? As she frames the conversation, she tells the king, if it weren't a matter of life and death, I wouldn't even annoy you with it. It wouldn't be worth your time. That's very gracious. It's a good way to get what you want, right? Part of making a request and interacting with people, especially if you want something, is to present it in a manner where it's easy to say yes, right? My dad always told me when I was a kid, if you want to go hang out with your buddies or whatever, make it easy for me to say yes. Have a plan, have the answers, right? I mean, so she says not only have they been cursed to die, but they've been sold to death, which is a true statement. If you remember, when Haman wrote this law and talked to Xerxes about it, he offered to pay to get it executed, to have it done, and Xerxes said, no, I'll pay for it. So Esther displays to us a great deal of humility. The comparison of being sold as slaves and the way she words it oozes humility to me. She tells Xerxes that she wouldn't bother him with something so trivial as being sold into slavery, which is a big deal. We all have to agree with that. But being sold to death is worthy of his attention. I would tell you, if you go back and reread the book of Esther, whenever she speaks, pay close attention. She's a wonderful example of a godly woman. Her words are always seasoned with salt, kind, gracious. She's gentle yet firm. And she's accurate without engaging in slander or exaggeration. She could have burst into tears and fallen on her knees and grabbed a hold of the king and made a begging, tear-filled plea, which, frankly, if it's a woman you really care about, that's an effective way to communicate to a man. I mean, it melts my heart when she's in tears, right? But she didn't. She exercised self-control. She remained calm. She told the facts. And she made sure it was known what was planned against her and her people. All right, verses 5 and 6. Now Xerxes is pretty mad. Who is this person that fills his heart to do these things? Where is he? And so remember last week I told you guys I didn't think that Xerxes really knew what the law had been written was. This is part of the reason. Because he seems oblivious. I really think he just trusted Haman that much. He assumed that Haman had identified a legitimate threat to the empire and trusted him to handle the situation. When Xerxes reacts with this kind of anger, it doesn't seem, just in reading it, like theater or an act, right? It seems earnest. If Xerxes was well aware of everything that had been done, he wouldn't have been surprised by this. And also, you might argue back at me, well, Xerxes didn't know Esther was a Jew. Agreed. But if you go back and reread when Haman sold his little deal, he never identifies who he's going to persecute. He just says, hey, we need to get rid of these people. The internal evidence seems to suggest that Xerxes didn't know. If Xerxes knew that it was the Jews who had been condemned, he would not have exalted Mordecai all day. I mean, he refers, in the previous chapter that we looked at last week, he refers to him as Mordecai the Jew. It just doesn't make sense to me that Xerxes was aware of exactly what Haman had written into law. And I know that makes him a flippant and terrible ruler, but that just is what it is. That's probably true in this front. So Esther answers the king, and this time the gloves are off. Not so seasoned with salt this time. She doesn't hold back. No slander, but she's direct and factual. An adversary and an enemy is this evil Haman, she cries out, and that is absolutely true. Haman, in my opinion, is an enemy of the empire, primarily in the sense of his ambition and pride. He was so proud, he was willing to commit genocide over the transgression of one man. Think about that. That's what Haman said. One person refused to do what I told him to, so I'm going to wipe out his entire race. That fits my definition of evil pretty well. And also, I think Haman's true goal is the throne itself. I think that Haman wants to be king. His only use for Xerxes is to elevate himself. He is an adversary and an enemy. So everything Esther has said is true, and although it's not as gentle as she usually is, sometimes there is a place for very blunt honesty. And I think it was appropriate here. So Haman, upon hearing these words, becomes terrified before the king and the queen. Can't say I blame them. I would be too. Verses 7 and 8. The king gets up and walks out to the garden. All right, that makes good sense to me. You ever been in a situation where you get so fiery, angry, that the best thing you can do is just remove yourself? Just walk away? That's what he did. He said, I'm going to go do a lap in the garden. Perhaps he learned from his little endeavor with Queen Vashti. Maybe he just didn't want to wrap his hands around the dude's throat right then. I don't know. But either way, he went and took a walk. So he walks out to the garden, and rather than follow him or try to plead with him, Haman decides he's going to plead with Esther. He's going to beg for his life from her. He knows the king is probably going to have him killed, and the only person in the kingdom that could possibly save him from it was Esther at this point. What an interesting reversal of events. A man who is a sworn enemy of the Jews and an Agagite has schemed to wipe out the Jews entirely, and now he's begging a Jewess for mercy. Not just a Jew, but a woman on top of it. That's got to sting that big pride of his. All right, before we go on to verse 8, everyone keep your finger in Esther, but turn with me to Matthew chapter 23. Went too far, Luke. Looking for Matthew chapter 23. Verse 1 will be good. So close. There it is. I'm going to read the first 12 verses just for context's sake, and I'll kind of glaze over the first 11 verses. What I really want to focus on is verse 12. So then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and keep. But do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. And they tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. And they love the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by men. But do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called instructors, for one is your instructor, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. So, first Jesus says the scribes and Pharisees have seated themselves on the chair of Moses. This is to say that they teach the traditions and laws of Moses. And he even tells them, do that. That's good. They're following the law. They're instructing you in the law. But then he says, do what they say, but don't do what they do, right? He recognizes that they are the religious authority and they are teaching properly, but they're bad examples. First, they don't practice what they preach. Second, they put extra burdens on people that they themselves don't do. And then Jesus says that they do everything they do to be noticed by men. They want the praise of people. They enlarge their phylacteries, right? The phylacteries were the little boxes with scriptures that they would pin one to their forehead and one of the arms, and then the tassels on their robes. They lengthen their tassels, trying to make themselves seem more pious or more religious. They seek the greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues. And then Jesus goes through a series of titles that they like to give themselves and be called by, right? Teacher, instructor, father. And I won't go off on a tangent on that one, but I do know of a Christian religion that has a leader who his title is the Latin word father. All right, so now that's the context of what Jesus is talking about. Going up to verse 12, right, is don't seek the praise of men. And in verse 11, he says, the greatest among you will be the servant of all. So whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And this is what we have observed so far through the story of Esther. Esther has been humble and was raised up to royalty. Haman has been conniving and scheming, seeking the praise of men, and as a result, he has been massively humbled. My dad used to tell me to be careful how I think about things, even simple daily tasks like driving. So whenever you think you've got something mastered, it'll jump up and bite you. So, humility is not to think less of yourself, right? It's to count others more valuable than yourself. Being humble requires an honest assessment of yourself, coupled with a desire to serve others. Esther could have easily told Mordecai, go pack sand, I'm going to hide in the palace and Xerxes will protect me. But she didn't. Instead, she put the lives of all the other Jews in the nation before her own with her simple words, if I perish, I perish. She counted others to be more important than herself. She humbled herself. And now she's been exalted and is being rewarded for her humility. Never do things for the praise of men. Do things instead for the glory of God. I warn you tonight that if you seek to exalt yourself before men or for their praise or honor, it may take years to happen, but God will humble you. And when God takes his belt off to spank you, it hurts a whole lot more than it would have if you just did it yourself to begin with. All right, you can go back to Esther now. Verse 8, Xerxes comes back inside from his stroll in the garden and finds Haman literally throwing himself at Esther on the couch, pleading for his life. I think Xerxes kind of misread what was happening here, okay? Or maybe he construed it in a manner that was advantageous to what he was about to order. I don't know. I can't read the man's mind. I want to give him the benefit of the doubt and say he misread the situation. So he perceives that Haman is now attacking Esther. Or some commentators read this to say that Xerxes thought Haman was trying to rape Esther. I can see where they might get that, but it's not how I read it. Nonetheless, Xerxes says, "Are you really going to attack my queen in my house while I'm still here?" Like, the nerve, dude. And then, so the last statement of verse 8 is kind of interesting. It says, "As the word came out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face." Okay, and that's to say, basically they put a bag over his head, which was a way of marking someone for death back then. Put a bag over his head in the presence of the king, that means he'll never see the king again, and the king will never see him again. He's dead. His fate is sealed. So then in verses 9 and 10, just as this is happening, one of the eunuchs enters and has a report. They have discovered the gallows that Haman constructed for Mordecai. So that struck me as odd. Just kind of reading it on the surface, it's like, man, well, that's a happy little accident that they happen to walk in right at the time that everything's been discovered. And but I got to thinking about it. The way this is worded, it says, "Behold, indeed." That's what the eunuch reports. So that's almost to say, as was rumored, this is the fact. So that makes me think that maybe when they went and got Haman to drag him to the feast, they were at his house and they saw the gallows. And they probably told Xerxes, like, "Haman has this pole set up in his front yard that's 50 cubits tall. Looks like he's getting ready to murder someone or something." And Xerxes probably said, "Well, go investigate. Go find out what's going on." And the eunuch probably showed up and looked at it and talked to Haman's wife and said, "Why is this here? What's it for?" And I'm sure she spilled the beans. She sang like a bird. So the eunuch reports that there is, in fact, a gallows 50 cubits high at Haman's home, and its intended use is to put Mordecai on, who spoke on behalf of the king. Translated, reported the murder plot against the king that he discovered, right? So the king does the most logical thing. Go put him on it. So Haman's hanged and the king's wrath subsides. So at this point, the bad guy of the story has been dealt with and the good guys are on the rise. Right? The movie's wrapping up, so to speak. But there's still one major problem. The law. There's still a law in the books that says all the Jews are to be killed on the 13th day of the 12th month. And it is an irrevocable law. So that problem is still looming. That's what the rest of the book's going to tell us about, how we get through that. So I know, looking at this story, the tendency is to kind of revel in the divine justice and the irony of Mordecai or Haman having to exalt Mordecai and then Haman being hanged on the gallows that he created for Mordecai, right? We all like to see the wicked punished for their deeds. When we are wronged or sinned against, we want justice. We want to see the guilty party pay the price for their transgression, right? My appeal to you tonight would be this. Don't seek justice. I don't want justice. You know what justice would give me? Eternity in lake of fire. I want mercy. God has been gracious to show us mercy in sending Jesus to die on our behalf and offering salvation by His grace through our faith. Be careful with how you think about things. Be honest in your heart. Jesus quoted, now the prophet's going to escape me. It's in chapter 6, verse 6. He said, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Go find out what this means. Right? I had a non-believer friend of mine ask me once, "Luke, what if someone murdered your wife? What would you want done for that guy?" I told him the truth. I said, I really don't know. I'd like to hope that in that moment, I would ask that he get saved. I can't promise that. But I know that I want mercy, not justice, because justice sends me eternally to hell. We should all try to adopt a heart that's compassionate toward the wicked, because we ourselves were once one of them. And the only true difference between us and them is the love and grace of the Lord Jesus Christ. All right, so next week we're going to continue on in chapter 8 and see what happens with our characters and how they handle the law that's on the books and deliver the Jews. Anyone, questions, comments, concerns, condemnations, rebukes?